Shouts cracked through the winding streets of Athens as rebel scribe Dorian ran beneath torchlit colonnades, the marble trembling beneath the iron-tipped sandals of the hoplites who hunted him. Flames hissed in the night wind, smearing long shadows across painted walls where demigods glared like silent witnesses. When the soldiers seized him, his knees struck the stone, and pain flared through his palms. He lifted his head just long enough to see a recovered ostrakan shard in the nearest guard's hand, his name carved deep, Dorian of Piraeus, enemy of the polis. The words felt heavier than iron chains. Sister Eleni, trapped by the enforced curfew, pressed herself against a column as the guards forced Dorian upright. She saw the tremor in his breath, the faint quiver at the corner of his mouth where fear met the cold Athens wind. Still, beneath that fear, a flicker of defiance glowed like an ember refusing to die. Nilos, the young apprentice who had followed Dorian's teachings in secret, slipped between the guards for the briefest heartbeat and pressed a folded prayer ribbon into his hand. Its fabric smelled faintly of incense and olive oil, a scrap of hope in a night built from dread. The hoplites dragged him forward, armor clattering in a harsh rhythm that echoed down the narrow stone passageways. Houses shuttered their windows, mothers pulled children away from the sound of civic judgment in motion. Dorian kept his gaze fixed on the path ahead, though every footstep felt like a descent into a deeper silence. He tasted dust and fear as they approached the Areopagus, a place where verdicts outlived the men who issued them. Beneath the looming hill, a bronze door waited half open, torchlight bleeding through its edges. The shadows beyond felt alive, shifting like forms cut from memory itself. Sister Eleni followed at a distance under threat, clutching her healer's satchel as if it were a shield against the fate awaiting them all. When the guards shoved him through the doorway, cold air swallowed him whole. The stone corridor beyond seemed carved not by tools but by the will of centuries intent on erasing dissent. Dorian understood then. The trial awaiting him would not simply judge his actions. It would unmake the man he had been. And in the hollow quiet of the Areopagus depths, he sensed something worse than soldiers waiting. He sensed a verdict crafted long before he arrived. Dorian descended into the tribunal chamber as if lowering himself into a tomb carved from polished marble. Water dripped from unseen cracks in the ceiling, each impact echoing across walls sculpted with scenes of civic virtue that mocked his presence. Braziers flickered in shallow alcoves, their light bending against mirrored surfaces that fractured every reflection into distorted ghosts. Sister Eleni guided trembling Nilos behind a support pillar, her breath tight with fear as the hooded strategoi encircled their prisoner. The air tasted of dust and old ink. A bronze stylus lay snapped in half on the tribunal floor, its pieces embedded in cracks like bones. Scholars centuries later would identify the etching along its shaft, a scribe's mark belonging to Dorian himself, broken by those who sought to silence his pen. The judges' voices cut through the stagnant air with mathematical precision. They recited his supposed crimes, inciting unrest with forbidden pamphlets, defying civic decrees, offering knowledge to those deemed unworthy of it. Guilt gnawed at Dorian as he listened, yet it was not guilt for rebellion. It was guilt for failing to protect those who had followed him into danger. Still, resilience tightened in his chest when Nilos caught his gaze and traced a quiet blessing across his heart. On a linen-covered table beside him waited a collection of tools, styluses polished to an unnatural shine, wax tablets marked with scratches, cords used for forced reenactments of testimony. These instruments were not made for harm in the usual sense. They were designed to shape memory, to tear truth from bone until only doctrine remained. The chief strategos lifted an iron rod and drew a circular symbol in the dust at Dorian's feet. It glowed faintly in the torchlight, like the eye of a forgotten god staring upward through the floor. When the judge announced that Dorian would undergo the rite of civic purification, a murmur rippled through the Strategoi ranks. Dorian felt cold settle along his spine. Innocence meant nothing here. Justice meant obedience. And the dissent awaiting him below this chamber promised an unmaking older than Athens itself. The guards stepped forward. The torches dimmed, and the path downward yawned open like the throat of a waiting beast. Torchlight smeared itself across the tunnel walls as Dorian's captors dragged him deeper beneath the Acropolis, their boots grinding into dust that had once been bone. The tunnels breathed cold, ancient air, thick with smoke that clung to the throat like a warning whispered by Sen. Taris of silenced men. Every footstep echoed as though the catacombs themselves announced his arrival. Sister Eleni followed under guard, pressing crushed herbs between trembling fingers, their scent rising faintly against the sour reek of mildew. She kept her gaze on Dorian, afraid that if she blinked, he would vanish into the darkness that had devoured so many before him. A guard's torch illuminated the inscription carved low along the stone, a rebel lashed to a pillar, flames climbing his legs. It was crude, hastily scratched, and older than the magistrates who now claimed power over memory. Later historians would find it and mark it as proof that Athens punished dissent long before the courts named it justice. For Dorian, it was a mirror of his future. Fear wrapped itself around him, cold as the chains biting his wrists. Yet beneath that fear, a fragile ember of hope flickered when Nilos, small and pale in the shadows, brushed past him as though tripping. A folded coded scroll slipped beneath Dorian's bound sleeve. The boy did not raise his eyes. That silent courage, soft, trembling, struck Dorian harder than any soldier's blow. The tunnel widened into a chamber lined with clay effigies. They stood in rows, each molded in the likeness of some condemned rebel from a forgotten uprising. Their hollow eyes reflected the torchlight, turning their cracked faces into witnesses. Dorian felt their gaze settle upon him, as if each one carried a fragment of the grief Athens refused to document. Guards shoved him to his knees. Rope scraped raw skin as it tightened around his wrists. Sister Eleni gasped, moving instinctively toward him, but a spear butt drove her back. She clutched the herbs to her chest as if they were a relic strong enough to shield them both. An inquisitor-like magistrate, robes dark, mask expressionless, stepped forward. He unfurled a set of instruments gleaming dully in the flickering light, rods shaped to force the limbs into rigid positions, polished stones meant to strike without leaving marks, tablets engraved with accusations that would guide the reenactments. These were tools crafted not for death, but for rewriting memory through pain. The magistrate murmured the name of the ritual, reenactment of sins against the polis. Chants rose from the tunnel, a low droning rhythm that hummed against the ribs. Dorian lifted his head, refusing to bow, and in that moment he sensed it, a quiet inhale behind him, the unmistakable presence of someone watching, someone who did not march with the guards. The shadows deepened, shifting like a creature preparing to step into the firelight. The guards pushed Dorian through a final archway, and heat washed over him like a wall. Bronze braziers ringed the chamber, hissing as oil fed their flames. Engraved panels towered along the walls, etched with scenes of Athenian triumph, glorified battles, stoic heroes, victories carved into stone so memory could not fade. Tonight, that same memory would be used as a weapon. The air warped above the flames, bending the silhouettes of masked magistrates who arranged their tools with a precision that made the skin crawl. The chamber felt too large, too hollow, as though its walls were waiting to absorb whatever screams they summoned. A fragment of a confiscated tablet rested upon a pedestal near the braziers, its surviving line later uncovered by archaeologists. A rebel must be remade before he is removed. The words glowed as if hot with prophecy. Fear crept into Dorian's chest, but defiance rose beside it, sharp and steady. His gaze found Nilos among the attendants, the boy half hidden, scattering sand in a pattern along the floor. Not random routes, markers, signals. A coded escape map sketched in dust that would vanish with a single misplaced step. Dorian's breath steadied. Resistance, no matter how fragile, still lived. Sister Eleni fought the guards as they forced her to the chamber's edge. She whispered blessings beneath her breath, tracing a trembling symbol across her palm. Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. She refused to let fear become silence. The magistrates lifted Dorian into a mechanical frame carved from oak and reinforced with bronze hinges. Gears creaked, ropes tugged, and wooden arms extended, gripping his wrists and ankles. The device shaped his limbs into angles mimicking the gestures he had written in his banned pamphlets, phrases of protest transformed into positions of forced submission. His own words twisted into his punishment. He winced as the ropes tightened. The magistrates murmured that rebellion began in the hands and ended in the spine. Thus, both must be disciplined. Smoke from the braziers curled around his face, stinging his eyes. Dorian forced himself not to look away from the engraved panels on the wall, the city's victories built upon sacrifices like his. A sudden metallic clang echoed overhead, a warning gong. The magistrates froze. One stepped back into the shadows and vanished as tea. Whole swallowed by the chamber, Dorian's pulse quickened. They expected betrayal. They prepared for it. He scanned the edges of the chamber. Sister Eleni did the same. Her gaze snapped toward the side entrance where shadows quivered unnaturally. A hooded figure slipped inside, moving with deliberate calm, steps silent even upon stone. The flames bent slightly as if acknowledging a shift in the room's balance. Dorian drew a shaky breath, unable to determine whether salvation or damnation drew near. The magistrates reacted instantly, forming a barrier between the stranger and the frame. They raised tools meant to twist truth into submission. The figure lifted one hand, gloved, revealing nothing yet promising everything. The gears surrounding Dorian groaned, tightening just enough to pull a cry from his throat. The chamber seemed to inhale. Smoke thickened, flames writhed higher, sand patterns near Nilos scattered beneath a guard's heel. Sister Eleni pressed both hands to her mouth, eyes widening with dread. The stranger took another step forward, darkness clinging to the hem of their cloak. The magistrates leaned in, ready to strike, ready to reshape rebellion into obedience. Dorian braced himself, heart pounding against the ropes constricting his chest. The punishment had begun, and the stranger was about to decide what kind of man Athens would attempt to erase or resurrect. Flames erupted the instant the rebels cut the ropes binding Dorian. The mechanical frame lurched, and magistrates crashed into toppled braziers as though divine judgment had struck the chamber. Fire leapt skyward, licking the carved victory panels until their triumphant figures twisted in molten shadows. Sparks rained like burning verdicts. Smoke flooded the air, thick and suffocating, turning every breath into a battle. Sister Eleni threw her arms around Nilos, shielding the boy as beams cracked overhead. He buried his face against her shoulder, clutching the coded scroll that had already risked too many lives. The chamber groaned like a wounded beast as stone fragments plummeted, ringing against the floor with the cold finality of shattered laws. Beyond the chamber, Athens awakened to chaos. The Acropolis roared with alarm as hoplites abandoned guard posts, their bronze greaves clattering upon marble. Citizens poured down stairways in frantic waves, robes tangling around fleeing ankles. Temple bells rang out of rhythm, striking against one another like frightened hearts. Smoke billowed through sacred colonnades. Statues of gods loomed in the haze, their stone eyes reflecting fire as if bearing witness to a truth Athens had forced itself to forget, that even the city of wisdom could tremble when its own laws devoured innocence. A shattered amphora fragment skittered across the floor near Dorian's feet, its painted sigil, an outlawed faction long suppressed, glowed faintly beneath soot. Centuries later, excavators would find that same fragment buried under scorched rubble, proof that rebellion had been thriving in the city's blind corners long before this night. Guilt punched through Dorian as screams echoed from deeper tunnels. Innocent scribes, attendants, healers were trapped in the crossfire of justice twisted into spectacle. He clenched his jaw, tasting smoke and regret, but forced himself forward. "This way," he shouted to the survivors, his voice hoarse. Behind a fallen relief panel carved with heroes offering tribute to the gods, he found the hidden stair he had memorized from forbidden records. But before they could descend, the chief magistrate emerged from the smoke, cloak torn, mask cracked, eyes burning with fanatic fury. He raised a ceremonial blade forged to defend the polis from its own children. The blade glinted beneath the carved reliefs depicting divine justice, scenes meant to inspire awe, now watching silently as Athens turned on one of its own. Dorian stepped forward, lifting a length of broken timber like a staff. His pulse thundered against his ribs. Sister Eleni pulled Nilos close, whispering a desperate prayer. Steel met wood with a shriek. The magistrate moved with ritual precision, each strike echoing the rigid laws he embodied. Dorian's arms shook under the force, yet defiance rooted him to the stone. He had written words meant to awaken the polis. Now he fought for the right to remember them. A beam collapsed behind them, scattering embers across the floor. Shadows danced wildly across the carved gods above, their features warping with each flare of flame. The magistrate lunged. Dorian twisted, slamming the timber against the man's knee. The blade clattered across the floor. They grappled beneath chiseled scenes of heroic idealism, images now mocking the brutality of the real city. With a final surge, Dorian struck the magistrate against the relief wall. Stone cracked. The man slid to the ground, mask shattering. His breath rattled once, then stilled. Silence trembled through the chamber, brief, fragile. Then horror. An S blared from the upper city. The elite guardians had arrived. Their war horns rolled across the Acropolis like thunder, breaking open the night. The ground vibrated beneath Dorian's feet. Firelight flickered against polished shields as lines of soldiers advanced, silhouettes moving with the cold unity of law sculpted into flesh. "We must go," Sister Eleni urged, voice shaking. She lifted Nilos, who clutched her robes and stared at the dead magistrate with wide, haunted eyes. Dorian shoved the relief aside, revealing the stair descending into darkness. "All of you move." Survivors poured into the narrow passage, feet pounding the stone steps. The roar of approaching guardians swelled behind them, echoing like a storm swallowing the city. Dorian took one last look at the blazing chamber, the place where Athens had tried to unmake him, and felt something shift inside him. Not victory, not triumph. Responsibility. He descended into the shadowed stairwell, sealing the fugitives' escape with a final heave. Athens burned above them, trembling beneath the weight of its own unraveling. Moonlight spilled across the sacred road like a pale river, guiding the fugitives into the night. Behind them, the Acropolis glowed red, its flames clawing at the sky, each flicker whispering the collapse of a city proud of its order, yet blind to its cruelty. Smoke drifted along the wind, carrying embers, and the faint, bitter scent of marble burned too hot. Dorian moved at the head of the scattered line, one hand gripping a fallen spear stained with soot. The other reached back often to steady those who stumbled, wounded citizens, trembling scribes, shepherd families who had abandoned their fields to join the march toward uncertain survival. Nilos pressed the coded scroll to his chest, its edges blackened but its message intact. The boy kept pace beside Sister Eleni, who whispered psalms to calm his shaking breath. Her cloak was damp with blood, some from the wounded, some likely her own, yet she walked with unwavering purpose. Along the road, bits of charred parchment fluttered in the wind like dark snow. One fragment caught on Dorian's shin. He bent to retrieve it. A tax ledger scrap, scorched around the edges, listing names marked for civic erasure. Names of people now walking in exhausted silence beside him. Regret tore through him, sharp, intimate. How many of these lives were placed in danger because he dared to speak truths the polis refused to face? How many more would vanish if he did not see this escape through? The night deepened around them, thick with the smell of ash and damp earth. The ancient olive trees swayed as though mourning, their silver leaves catching moonlight like tears suspended in air. Generations of exiles had walked this road. Their shadows seemed to move with the fugitives, urging them onward. Hoofbeats cracked across the stones. Close, too close. The guardians had found their trail. Dorian lifted the spear, muscles taut, breath steadying. Sister Eleni positioned herself behind the wounded, Nilos gripping her sleeve. Families huddled together, their eyes reflecting terror and determination in equal measure. The wind howled through the branches, carrying both warning and witness. The sacred road had seen exiles vanish, rebels crushed, and fugitives hunted. Tonight, it would decide who lived long enough to be remembered. The fugitives moved through terraced hills where silence clung to the stones like old sorrow. Beyond a field of broken statues, Dorian found the sanctuary, its columns shattered, its roof collapsed, its altar fractured as though struck by divine fury. Moonlight threaded through the ruins, casting pale lines across the ground like remnants of an abandoned prophecy. Dorian knelt before the broken altar. His hands trembled as he pressed a stylus into soft wax, engraving the testimony Athens had attempted to strangle. Each carved line felt like a defiance older than the city itself. The wax tablet glowed faintly beneath the moon, its message fragile yet unyielding. Behind him, Sister Eleni moved among the wounded, her breath unsteady but her hands unwavering. She whispered reassurance as she wrapped bandages, her fingers shaking from exhaustion and cold. Nilos crouched beside veteran rebels, tracing escape routes in the dirt, paths that wound toward distant coasts beyond Athens's reach. A bronze coin glinted near a fallen column. Its owl, Athena's emblem of wisdom, was violently scratched out. Centuries later, excavators would label it an artifact of defiance, proof that even the wise had learned fear. Hope flickered among the fugitives, but dread sharpened its edge. Rumors seeped through the night. A new magistrate had risen, sworn to eradicate every rebel bloodline. His hunt stretched beyond the courts, beyond the tunnels, into legend. Dorian stepped into the open courtyard. Wind swept through the pillars, carrying dust and warnings. Across the distant hills, torchlights crawled like watchful specters, closing in on the wounded sanctuary. The fragile future trembled with each breath of wind, and the darkness gathering at the horizon felt less like night and more like judgment. At the first pale spill of dawn, Dorian climbed a shattered pillar rising above the sanctuary ruins. Frost clung to his cloak, turning each breath into a cloud that drifted into the waking light. Below him, the fields shimmered gold, as if the earth itself strained toward renewal despite the violence of the night before. He raised Nilos's prayer ribbon, its fabric worn, its threads pulled thin by fear and hope alike, and tied it around the jagged stone. The wind caught it instantly, tugging its message toward the valleys beyond Athens. A bronze clasp, later discovered buried in the rubble, confirmed Sister Eleni stood beside him as witness to the vow that reshaped their fate. Defiance rose within Dorian not as a roar but as a steady pulse. He did not seek a throne, nor the fall of any city-state. He sought only to guard the truth, truth carved in wax, carried in rebellion, and preserved by those brave enough to flee with him. Children gathered behind him, their shadows long against the warming earth. They watched smoke from distant watchfires coil upward, signaling the city-states stirring for pursuit. The wind carried the scent of ash, fear, and unraveling order. Dorian pressed his hand to the stone, sealing the oath into the morning air. Athens would not claim the final word. The polis had shaped his suffering, but it would not define his legacy. Yet as the ribbon fluttered in the wind, one question lingered sharp, haunting, unresolved. Would history remember him as a rebel, or as the man who resisted disappearance itself?